Hello there, sword fans. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is the sword of Dirilis Ertugrul, and I'm sorry about my pronunciation. It's a sword from swordbuy.com, and a couple quick disclaimers before I get into this Ottoman sword review right here. One is a review sample from the folks at swordbuy.com, so special thanks to them for sending it my way. If you think it makes me biased to get the sword for free or something like that, then you know at the start. Two, I do not study any type of swordsmanship that involves a sword like this. So I do study swordsmanship, but of a different variety. So my musings and ramblings, apart from just being my own personal opinion, are really that of a novice, and you should have that context before you hear me muse and ramble further. Before I do the rest of the review as well, a couple notes about price. It is a $300 sword, and I believe that includes shipping. It might or it might not. I can't exactly recall. I will put links in the description down below to where you can get one, as well as measurements, the weapon dynamics computer, and all of that kind of stuff. So anyway, with all that in mind, I will begin the actual review now. And the purpose of that review, incidentally, is to go over build quality. I told you I don't know much about it, but I can tell you build quality. I can show you high-res photos. I will push the sword to failure, though I have not done that at this point in the review. It's together, so I can review build quality and take measurements and such. But I have cut with it. I have done some abusive cutting as well. I cut a water block, and I'll talk about that. But I haven't broken it apart yet. I will do that, and at the end of it, my hope is that you'll have some supplemental information or more information, or learn about the product and determine yourself if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. So without further ado, I'll actually get to that. The pommel, the end bit, this cap right here is what I talk about first. And this is just basically a big piece of brass. And it has chamfered edges, but it doesn't have any ornamentation or decoration. I believe there are other iterations of this style of sword that have a different type of pommel or different execution on it. So if you happen to like one of those better, there are different varieties available. But there are chamfered edges. Nothing bites into my hand. Nothing is bad. Nothing is loose or has come loose during the basic testing or even semi-abusive testing I've done so far. But it's just basically a big brass block, and it's worth, I guess, noting that it doesn't hurt my hand. But apart from being brass and having chamfered edges, there's not really much to speak of here in terms of ornamentation or decoration. In terms of a counterweight as well, I think it's maybe a little bigger than it needs to be. I'm not sure how much it offsets the point of balance, which is a little higher up here on this blade. It's about 5.5 inches up. I'll talk again about that in a moment. It comes with this little wrist restraint, this little Wii controller strap to not throw the sword out of your hand. I did find that it's a little short for me, and it tends to restrict my wrist if I'm trying to bring the sword back or flick it around. So my dumb hands don't fit through it particularly well either. So I found this to be more of an irritation than anything else. It looks like it's attached to the same cord wrap that the handle is done in, and I can't tell if this is imitation leather or real leather. Either way, it's relatively slick, and that brings us up to the grip right here. Now, I like that it's got a spiral leather wrapped grip on it, and I like that there's some little detailing in here. All of that, apart from being aesthetically nice, is adds to the sensation of grip. I can kind of feel those little indentations and things like that grab my hand, and it gives me a little bit more sense of purchase than I would have otherwise, though the leather wrap on here is also a little bit slick. So while the texture aids the grip, the kind of slickness does not. If I really pinch down, I can still kind of turn the grip in my hand, which means that when I get to the smashy part of the review, I'm suspecting that it's going to roll and twist in my hand and be a little bit of a struggle to hold on to. It's worth noting, though, that in the cutting I've done so far, which is only mildly abusive, none of that has been a problem. It stayed indexing well. And it's also worth noting that this grip is kind of cool from the sense that it's this rectangle that's shaped where the long way goes towards your hands, which seems odd. It almost feels like the grip should be faced the wrong way. But I've seen examples of this on Ottoman swords at the Oakshott Institute or swords from the region, and it actually indexes really well. The wide area of this kind of rectangular-ish grip actually feels pretty good in the hand, and it's surprising how comfortable it is. It does allow you to maneuver the grip in a few different ways, though I don't know if you would open your grip or if you would hold it further down, if you would bring a hand or a finger over. Either way, if I just hold it in a hammer grip, I feel like I immediately know where the edge is, and it actually stayed pretty well aligned in my hand as I was moving it around. The sword doesn't weigh a whole lot either. It's about 2 pounds or a little bit less. And so in your hand, just moving it around as it is, it's not terribly cumbersome to control overall. It's got a little bit higher point of balance, so this grip, you do feel some authority. It does move around a little bit. It does want to come out a little bit, but at the same time, I would say the grip and the way it rests in your hands fits naturally, and you're able to maintain some control. Though, again, my main gripe would be that it's a little bit on the slick side. And I don't like when a sword, when I can hold it tightly in my hand, if I index it and hold it tightly, and I try to push the crossguard, I want to be able to hold it tight enough where I can't just twirl it in my hand. Anyway, don't know how common that is, but I would note that maybe if the leather were less slick or less sheeny or something, that maybe that would do it. Or if there were a different set of risers or something in there, that might help if that's a problem or concern for other folks. If I move up to the crossguard here, the ledges on this one are a little bit sharper. They're not as well chamfered as they were on the little pommel piece. So if I really choke up on the guard here, the fat of my hands, this is uncomfortable. Apart from the pressure and tension, I can feel these kind of sharp ledges running into the flub of my hand, and they are not so sharp that they're bad, but they are sharp enough where they're uncomfortable. And if I really impact something, it's possible that I'm gonna get a scrape that I'm not comfortable with. Out towards the end, they do get a little bit sharper as well. And I can also notice some imperfections in the casting or sanding or something like that. There's a little bit of asymmetry and a few sharper ledges even out towards the end. I can pick my fingernail off. They're sharp enough. So there is that. The shape-wise, I happen to like it. I think it's a handsome-looking guard. I like the brass look. I think it has ornamentally something that is very appealing to the eye. If I move up towards the top of the guard, up here, the gap where the blade meets the cross is wider. I can see into it. But given how the scabbard is constructed, I think that's par for the course. Though I can really see that there's like almost a bead of weld or a shim or something that goes in there. And there's also very rough casting quality on the inner side. Now, given that this is a mere polish blade down here, I can actually see it reflected, and so I can see the rough polish reflected back, and I think that aesthetically is less appealing. All the rest of it has a nice buff and shine to it, but I can see the rough casting quality behind or just through the mere surface on the sword here. So I can see it, and then it looks cheap the way the blade slots in down there. I can make out a lot of spots where water could run in, or that might be problematic. I don't know how. I don't know what other options there might be. I've seen other swords filled with pitch or epoxy or something like that. Either way, I think it's just a rough finishing quality, and really the only spot behind the curtain on this sword that has a rougher finish than anywhere else. If I talk about the scabbard as well, this is the other piece that I'm maybe a little bit less fond of. The fittings on here, have kind of keychain rings, if you will, for the little holster pieces, which are somewhat unbecoming. The casting on the scabbard as well is less than. I can make out the seams on either side. I can make out little casting imperfections, though it does have a nice kind of floral pattern, from what I can tell anyway, and the fittings themselves are handsome, but the casting lines, or at least the decoration on them, could be handsome, but I can make out casting seams and lines as well. There's large slots where the leather is not butting up to the scabbard particularly well, and overall it seems beneath the actual sword itself. It seems of a lesser quality than the actual sword. Now, if I put the sword in the scabbard, it's worth noting as well that there are some little rails, if you will, that do kind of guide this brass. I can't remember exactly what this middle piece is called here, but it's supposed to kind of guide it in, and then it holds with tension. It doesn't fall out particularly easy, but it draws reasonably well, so the tension is pretty good. But sometimes they don't, the rails don't line the sword up and cause it, create the effect of sheathing well, and then they get stuck because there's rough surfaces underneath here. So you got to kind of gingerly put it together, and then when you do, I can certainly make out slots where it's not even. It's tighter on this side, the blade side, and then there's about an eighth of an inch gap on the back end side of the sword. It does have a little bit of rattle, and I can feel it move around in there. And again, anyway, the scabbard, between the seam lines, the lesser casting quality, the keychain rings to hold it down, it just seems like a lesser scabbard in contrast to the rest of the sword. But I'm going to get to the blade, the pointy stabby part, the part you are probably more interested in. Now, forgive the marks on here. This is not ornamentation that they provided. These are my measurements from the Weapon Dynamics computer, where I take some measurements and I'm moving them around, and I mark it with a silver Sharpie as I take those measurements, so I can figure out where the blade nodes are and where it rotates when I hold it in certain places and things like that. And those measurements are in the description down below. What I can tell you about the blade is, one, it has a nice kind of mirror polish to it, and there are some tool markings along where the edge has been sharpened. It came with a very suitably sharp edge. I was able to pop pool noodles apart with it relatively easily, and so it came out of the box really, really quite sharp, which is fantastic. I don't like when swords are sold sharp and then come with an edge that doesn't cut bottles and pool noodles and the like without further sharpening. So I tip of my hat to the folks at Swordbuy for having a sufficiently sharp edge. There were some marks, some tool markings along the edge to achieve this, but not a big secondary bevel. And for the tool marks that are there, I would rather have a good sharpening surface like this with some tool marks, at least in the price category of a $300 sword, than not, and have a different profile of edge or a big secondary bevel or any other option. So I think that for the price quality, this is okay. But do know that along the edge, there are some tool markings and things like that. The blade has a very nice fuller that runs almost the entire length of the sword. I think some of the options that they have are also blades that don't have the fuller ring or might have a slightly different fuller ring to them. And so do bear in mind that if you don't like the fuller, that there are options with or without. The false edge is not sharpened, though that could be sharpened. I, again, don't practice any type of swordsmanship here, so doing kind of reverse cuts and cutting with the false edge is not something I'm particularly capable with, so I didn't bother sharpening it, though it seems to have a profile where that could be achieved. There would be a little bit of work because the back edge on here is somewhat meaty, and it would require some time to get the same level of profiled edge that the main blade or the primary blade on the sword does. This one also came with a little engraving. That's something that I noted that they offer on their website. This one says Matt J. It's got my name on it, which was a nice little surprise. It wasn't something I asked for in the sample, but they put it on there, which was very nice. And I've seen some other examples where there's different types of symbols and lettering and engraving, or rather etching. I suppose I should say not engraving, because it's some sort of etch that's on here rather than engraved and carved into the sword. And that's kind of nice. So if you have some sort of thing that you would like etched on the sword, some sort of ornamentation that's specific to you or would make the sword more special or bespoke to you, it's nice that that level of customization is available. So when I hold the sword this way, it has a nice imposing look that looks at least historically plausible. And I'm not an expert in how accurate it is to the things it's trying to represent. But when I turn it this way, that's where it starts to lose me. It's 3.5 millimeters thick here at the base and runs that roughly throughout the blade. And I'll put measurements down in the description below. It has a flex that's roughly in the center, and it even starts to take a set when I start to do that too much. It suggests to me that the steel one is a little bit on the soft side, though I did test it. It's somewhere between 50 and 55, and that my 50 file doesn't bite in, my 55 file does. Anyway, these swords don't necessarily have to have distal taper. I've looked at some historic pieces that do and don't, and I really don't know enough about the Ottoman swords to say historically if they did. If you know, throw it in the commentary down below. What I would argue, though, is that this material that they're using, this bar stock presumably, is a little too thin. At 3.5 millimeters thick, it just doesn't have the rigidity to feel quite right. It's a little too flexible. By contrast, I have a couple other examples here. One, this is a windlass shamshear. It's just a millimeter thicker, but the way this feels in terms of how rigid it is, it's a thinner blade in profile, but just being that millimeter thicker, it has a lot more rigidity to it. And if this sword had a similar kind of rigidity, I think it would benefit from the thickness. I have another sword here, a Cold Steel 1776. Reproduction, and this one starts off at 7.5 millimeters thick, so much thicker, and then tapers down to roughly even a little bit thinner than this one does at about 3 or 2.5 millimeters thick. Now this is a much more heavy, imposing sword, but it's also longer, and it just stands to show that I believe these are made in India, that distal taper is possible for swords in the same price category. Obviously, they're a very different sword, so I'm not saying it has to be, but this one seems to. It just flexes around. It has too much flex in the lower third of the blade. It's not whippy exactly, but it has more flex than I would argue is appropriate. And if it were, I think, just a millimeter thicker, that would stand to reason that it would beef the sword up in such a way that it would lose some of that. Now, it might be a little bit heavier, and maybe that'll detract from the feeling, but if similar fullering is put in, I think that you could maintain some some level of nimbleness while simultaneously addressing some of the whippiness or flexibility that I feel dynamically in the sword. So to talk about cutting a little bit, I did, as I mentioned, cut a pool noodle. It popped right through the pool noodle. It was really, really easy to do. It had a nice sharp edge, and it was easy to move around and really fun. This was a fun sword to move because it's not terribly heavy. And if you're moving it around and not shaking it side to side, the flexibility doesn't show through so much. However, when I take it to water bottles, or not water bottles, but a frozen water jug and cut through that, it cut through actually pretty well. But I did feel the shock. I did feel some of the whippiness in the sword in cutting some of those thicker targets. The other bit I want to note is that I cut some frozen branches. Now, bear in mind that these were green before the season changed, so they're basically like ice wood. they're frozen, but they were pretty wet, so they have a lot of water content in them. And there are some very minor edge deflections in the sword right now, so I did diminish the edge just a little bit, which again suggests that the sword is a little bit on the softer side. So it took some minor edge damage, not a lot. I would argue that if you had any competency in sharpening, that they would come out, and you have to be really particular before you see them. But there were some very minor edge deflections from doing that frozen log chopping. Anyway, that's where I'm at in the sword right now. At this point, I'm going to go out and I'm going to push the sword to failure and see how much it takes. And so I'll shut up here and get on with that. All right, sword friends, it is the future, and I can reflect on some of the abusive parts of my testing, if you want to call it that. First, water bottles. It didn't diminish the edge the same way it did previously, so maybe that spot was there before, or maybe it wasn't, and it just was an odd soft spot. But either way, I cut through the neck of some pretty thick bottles, and I didn't notice the same problem. It thrust real easy, and I was more accurate with the sword than I expected it to be. So in terms of just comfortable sword to use on water bottles, I had a lot of fun doing that, and I wish I had more bottles. The next bit, though, wood. So I noticed that in chopping in the wood, and do bear in mind that these branches, even though it's a little warmer out today, they're still mostly frozen, and it cut through a lot of them, even thicker bits than I was expecting it to. And I did notice, though, some of the rattle started to develop. That was one thing. Two, I noticed that the blade started to bend and twist along the edge, but not necessarily on the spine. So it's soft, basically. It's taking a bend a little easier. And some of the little S-curves that I was starting to see on the edge are not as easy to correct as a little swack on the side of the stand. It was diminishing in one portion and not in the other, so it's a little twisty in some ways. It held an edge, though, pretty well. On chopping through the log, I started to notice that the rattle started to develop. And I also did a little bit of a tip test and a twist, and I noticed that it would take a bend in the tip. So bendiness seems to be something happening throughout. Throwing it at the tree as well, it stayed together, but I did notice that the handle started to come undone. Some of this leather is pushed around. The guard has rattled and did so quite a bit more, and I lost the little tassel bit at the end of the lanyard piece as well. I don't know I don't know exactly where that went. In one of the tosses, I believe it hit the trellis or this metal thing that I have for flowers around, and that's, I believe, what gave the ding in the edge. And also, the guard buried itself in the tree on one of the throws, and so it's sharp enough where if I throw it, that's actually the only part that I got to stick. In terms of other predictions, as I noted, this part was sharp, and it did bite me. It tore off a chunk of skin, and I don't remember exactly where, but I think it was on one of the logs. I was striking without a glove on, and my finger caught in there, and it bled quite a bit. So anyway, it like I said, was a little bit sharp, and it did bite me, and I was predicting the future a bit on that one. Anyway, other than that, a little bit bendy. The edge held up actually reasonably well, all things considered, but the sword does have a little bit of flex to it. In cutting, I did also start to notice on the log that it would turn in my hand as kind of predicted, particularly when I put the glove on. Once I did that, it would twist in my hand quite a bit more. I didn't notice it so much barehanded, but I did start to notice it a lot more with the glove. I also didn't notice a lot of reverberation in my hand. So in some cases, hitting the steak or the logs, I noticed a bit of vibration in my hand, and it was uncomfortable, but not super painful. And there's a lot of shock. I'm hitting, in some cases, pretty hard, so I didn't feel a lot of vibration in my hand. It held together. And whatever construction method, obviously, this has developed a slight wiggle, but whatever tang they're using, whatever size, it held together in this part and didn't break off at the hilt at all. None of the furniture components here, apart from the little tassel bit, came off. And the rest of it, despite the tassel coming off, this didn't come unwound. It did start to move around towards the crossguard area, though. Anyway, Croquet Steak of Doom, it took a big hearty chunk out of the croquet steak, or the croquet stick took a big hearty chunk out of this, and it was penetrating about a millimeter and a half into with each strike. And honestly, it didn't diminish much more than that. So it only cut in or reduced the finer points of the edge. And again, anyone with a competency in sharpening would be able to smooth those out, basically, and not get rid of the issues and give a good profile. You'd lose a little bit of the character of the blade, perhaps some of the meat, but it could certainly have been profiled, and an edge could have been put back on it if you had some capability there. So it didn't cut in like 5 millimeters or something like that, but it did lose chunks with each strike into the Croquet Stick of Doom, which in fairness is expected. That's typically what happens. Reversing it and striking on the spine, though, it didn't take too many hits to get it to break off. And I was striking down here, and it broke up here at one of the points where I was whacking earlier. And that's, honestly, it's a pretty thin blade. It's realistically what I expected, but a lot of times these softer blades that have a little bit more flex to them tend to last longer. It's worth noting as well that I'm testing on a colder day. It's a little above 30 outside right now. Stuff is melting slightly. So it's not quite freezing, but it's drifting in and out. It was snowing earlier today, freezing earlier today, and technically when I'm testing this, it's a little bit above freezing. So anyway, temperature may have affected it. Sometimes the cold tends to make things a little bit more brittle, though it wasn't exactly like I'm testing it in 20 below or 10 below like I have with some other swords. So this seemed to hold up about as expected. It was a chance to impress. And honestly, I think it's fair to say that I maybe expected it to last a little bit more. Given that I saw it was soft, I thought it would probably flex a little bit more than break when it did. Anyway, all in all, it did hold up well. It made it all the way to the Croquet Steak of Doom. Again, I whacked logs. I cut large, thick branches that are mostly frozen in half. I threw it at a tree several times. I bent it quite a bit. And in all of those cases, it held up and maintained its functionality as a weapon. It certainly could have some improvements. This grip material could be a little bit tighter. The edges along the guard could be a little softer. And the blade, I think, just if it had a little bit more thickness here, that would be enough. In terms of durability, though, for a $300 sword in this type, I'm satisfied with the results. It made it all the way through the Croquet Steak of Doom and didn't break on the first whack. It took several strikes in, and to me, though that's a recipe to break it. Would have been nice if it lasted longer, but I would say that it's sufficient. So anyway, that brings me to the point, do I personally think it's worth it or not? For me, personally, it's no. And I'll elaborate on that, but first I'll elaborate on why it's maybe a yes. I don't think it's a ripoff. I think it offered quite a lot. It was a fun sword to move around. It's in an underrepresented category where there's not a ton of options for this style saber if you're interested in them. And what you get is a sword that's nice and sharp. It held up to cutting and was certainly functional. It held up all the way to pretty abusive stuff. There's customization options and things like that. And while there's some areas to improve, you certainly get a lot. You got a functional sword for $300, and I believe that includes shipping. It also came with a relatively nice display case type thing. I'm not big on the boxes, but I would say this kind of deep blue color with silver accents on it was pleasant and has some nice accents inside as well, or some nice kind of white silkish material for display. So if that's your thing, I think, again, all things considered, it's a reasonable package. It's handsome and it's functional. So I don't think it's a ripoff. I don't think it's a bad sword. And I think if you wanted a sword like this and there weren't other options that may be closer to, some incorporating some of the things that I would argue need to be improved, then yes, I think that this is a good sword. And the folks over there were easy to work with, and they seem to have a lot of happy customers. So for that, I would say yes. For me personally, though, no. I like the grip, honestly. This is one of the things that I like the most. It would be nice. I like the shape of it, I guess I should say. It's a little slick, but I do like the shape of it. I'd like it if obviously, it didn't bite into me when I cut things, particularly hard things. And the main thing, I think, realistically, this crossguard, some of the roughness underneath it needs to be cleaned up. The gap is a little bit on the cheap side, and that's tough for me to get over. And the thickness, the main thing is the thickness of the blade. I just don't think it's thick enough. It's a little bendy. Even if they're going to continue using this stainless steel type material, it seems to be sufficient for swords. It holds an edge reasonably well. It seems like it maintains its sharpness on most of the soft targets. And so I don't have a gripe with the steel. It seemed to be fine, but it's too thin. The bar stock they're using, or whatever stock they're using to make it as thick as it is, seems to be on the thin side. I'd love to see if it was either a little thicker and maintain the rest of the same shape, maintaining these thick fullers, because they really removed a lot of weight, but just some extra meat down in this ricasso area I think would go a long way. And if they could incorporate some distal taper, all the better. I'd really like that. So a little cleaner here, a little less sharp here, and a little thicker, and maybe some taper introduced. I don't know exactly if these swords historically had taper, but if they could at least get them a little bit thicker and incorporate even some of the other stuff that they have here with the fullering, I think it'd be a winner, and I would like it. I would like it a lot more. Grip material and stuff, I think, also is an opportunity. It wasn't bad, but it was a little slippery. It was handsome, though. So the rest of the stuff, Scabbard, I'm not partial to. I noted what I think could be improved there, but I'm mainly looking at the sword. Given that it comes with a Scabbard as well, only adds to the value that you're getting. I really want to see more improvements on the sword. Obviously, the Scabbard is an opportunity as well, though. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully it's helpful. Thanks again to swordbuy.com for sending the review sample over. I hope the stuff was interesting and gave you the information you need to decide if it's worth your money or not. That's all I've got, though. Cheers, and thanks for watching.